Imagine you're at 12,000 feet of altitude, stepping off a plane in La Paz, Bolivia.
Which is already pretty intense just physically, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But imagine you are 60 years old. You're this self-made millionaire, like a really charismatic Louisiana Bayou auto parts mogul.
The kind of guy who built an absolute empire. I mean, starting from just a single dusty gas station.
Exactly. You are the kind of guy who thrives on the hustle. You secure million-dollar deals over ribs and booze in ramshackle bars, all while, just sipping a club soda yourself.
Right. Your entire identity is completely wrapped up in this relentless, unyielding drive.
Yeah, but right now, on this tarmac in South America, something is breaking inside your brain. You start staggering around. You begin throwing coins at local children.
Wow.
Yeah, and you launch into these angry, rambling monologues that make absolutely no sense to anyone.
So obviously his terrified wife cancels the vacation. I mean, by day 4, she just drags him back home to Louisiana.
Right. And over the next few weeks, the physical disorientation actually fades. Like, he can walk perfectly fine again.
But his personality, right,
Yeah.
that relentless drive that built a whole empire.
It is completely, utterly gone.
Yeah, you sit in front of a television all day and you don't even care what channel's on. You just stop checking in on your business.
You stop initiating any conversations.
Exactly. You become this ghost of your former self, just living in a state of, profound, unbothered passivity.
This is the true story of Robert Philippe. And we're starting today's deep dive with his tragic, bizarre transformation because, well, to understand the hidden mechanics of real productivity, we first have to understand what happens when productivity and motivation simply vanish.
It's the perfect baseline.
Welcome, everyone. Today, our mission is deciphering those hidden mechanics based on the deeply researched insights from Charles Duhigg's nonfiction book, Smarter, Faster, Better.
And we really want to dismantle this deeply ingrained industrial age misconception, right? The idea that being productive means running faster on a hamster wheel.
Okay, yeah, let's unpack this. Because productivity isn't about sweating harder or, locking yourself in a room for 14 hours.
No, not at all. It's an intricate ecosystem of the choices we make and, crucially, the underlying psychology of how we make them.
So how are we breaking this down today?
Well, we're going to map out this ecosystem across 3 distinct layers. First up, we'll decode motivation, and not as some innate character trait, but as a biological mechanism that we can actually trigger.
I love that. And the second lane.
Second, we'll look at teams. Like, what happens when highly driven individuals collide and how to engineer a collective intelligence that doesn't just, devolve into an ego contest.
Which happens a lot.
All the time. And finally, we'll examine focus. How to protect our attention and our decision-making in an era where automated systems are quietly hijacking our cognitive reflexes.
So if you're listening to this, whether you are managing a massive corporate merger or just trying to dig yourself out of an inbox with, 4,000 unread emails.
Yeah. Or even just trying to marshal enough energy to be present with your kids after a brutal Tuesday.
Exactly. The stories we're unpacking today reveal this totally counterintuitive truth. Enduring success requires significantly less brute force struggle and way more deliberate framing of our reality.
So let's go back to Robert Philippe, right? He's sitting in front of his television in Louisiana.
Right.
His wife, Viola, understandably assumes he's suffered a massive stroke. Or maybe he's battling severe clinical depression.
I mean, that's what anyone would think.
Right, so she takes him to the chief of neurology at the Ochsner Clinic in New Orleans, Dr. Richard Strub. And Dr. Strub runs an exhaustive battery of tests.
And the medical investigation reveals something incredibly strange. Robert's vital signs are flawless.
Pristine blood work, yeah.
His IQ hasn't dropped a single point. He can perfectly recall his childhood memories.
Yeah.
Like, if you hand him a complex business contract, he can read it and understand every single clause.
So his cognitive engine is still completely intact.
Right. He hasn't lost his intelligence at all.
He hasn't lost his intelligence. And perhaps even more surprisingly, he hasn't lost his happiness.
Wait, really?
Yeah. When Dr. Strub asks him, point blank, if he's depressed or unhappy, Robert replies, "No, I feel good."
He's perfectly content.
He is. He knows exactly what he could be doing with his day. He just lacks any trace of desire to actually do it. He basically lost the biological capacity to initiate action.
And as it turns out, Robert wasn't just some isolated medical anomaly. A few years later, a French neurologist named Michel Habib begins investigating a whole cluster of identical cases.
Right, like there's a 60-year-old brilliant academic professor who suddenly just stops working.
And there's a teenager who goes to the beach, lies down in the sand, and sustains severe, blistering sunburns simply because she lacks the internal motivation to get up and walk 10 feet into the shade.
It's terrifying. So Habib looks at the MRI scans of these profoundly apathetic patients, including Robert Philippe's scans. He's searching for a common denominator.
And he actually finds it, right? Deep inside the brain.
He does. Tiny pinpricks of damage. Essentially, these burst microvessels localized in a very specific area called the striatum.
Okay, let's unpack the neurobiology here, because this is where the traditional view of motivation completely shatters for me.
Oh, totally.
Most of us think of motivation as a moral failing if we don't have it, or, a burst of willpower if we do, but it's physical anatomy.
Exactly. We have the prefrontal cortex, which is the highly evolved front part of our brain where we make logical, conscious decisions.
That's the part of Robert that still knows how to read a business contract.
Right. Then deep down, we have the basal ganglia, which is a much older, more primitive part of the brain that governs movement and processes raw emotion.
So the prefrontal cortex can formulate a brilliant plan, but it cannot execute it alone. It needs the basal ganglia to physically and emotionally propel the body into action.
Then the bridge between those two regions, the central dispatch that relays the logical command and translates it into an emotional, physical drive, is the striatum.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Is the striatum essentially acting as the transmission of a car?
That is the perfect way to visualize it.
Because if we look at Robert Philippe, his prefrontal cortex is the engine. It's a high-performance engine. It's revving perfectly. His intelligence and memory are untouched.
But because those tiny blood vessels burst, his transmission is completely shot.
Right. The engine is spinning, but it cannot engage the wheels. The logical thought just can't translate into forward momentum because that biological bridge is broken.
Exactly. Without the transmission engaging, the brain receives zero emotional reward for taking action. The patients Habib studied were physically capable of movement. They weren't paralyzed.
It just felt absolutely numb to the anticipation of a reward.
Yes. Motivation isn't a personality quirk. It's a strict biological imperative reliant on a dopamine feedback loop. If the brain doesn't anticipate a feeling of reward, it simply refuses to spend the energy to act.
So if motivation requires an anticipated reward, what is the specific reward our brain is actually craving? Because it isn't just money or food.
No, it's something much deeper. A researcher named Mauricio Delgado at the University of Pittsburgh actually isolated this craving in a lab.
Right. He wanted to see this biological transmission engage in real time.
So he recruited participants, slid them into an fMRI machine, and subjected them to an experiment that was engineered to be profoundly, mind-numbingly boring.
I love this study. The setup was a number-guessing game on a screen. A number between 1 and 9 would appear, and the participants simply had to guess if it was higher or lower than 5.
That is the entire game. Just incredibly tedious. But Delgado introduced a massive twist.
The game was entirely rigged.
Completely. Your choices had absolutely zero impact on the outcome. The computer had a predetermined sequence of wins and losses.
Everyone won the exact same amount of money. Everyone lost the exact same amount of times. It was a completely meaningless exercise.
Yet, when the participants were allowed to physically press the button to lock in their own guess, the fMRI scans showed their striatum, that transmission bridge, lighting up like a Christmas tree.
It was flooded with dopamine and excitement.
Exactly. They were playing a rigged, tedious game, but their brains were biologically thrilled.
But then Delgado shifts the parameters for the second phase of the experiment, right?
He does. The odds remain exactly the same. The payouts remain exactly the same. But now, half the time, the computer simply makes the guess for the participant.
And the moment the computer takes over, the participant's striata go completely dark. The motivational center of the brain just instantly powers down.
And when interviewed later, the participants reported hating this phase of the experiment. They felt bored, frustrated, and viewed the game as this agonizing chore.
All of the variables were identical, except for one thing. They were no longer the ones pushing the button.
The profound realization here is that motivation is triggered by the mere perception of control. The human brain is hardwired to crave agency.
Even a totally hollow, meaningless choice, like guessing a rigged number, is enough to ignite the striatum, because the act of choosing affirms our autonomy.
Every single time we assert control over our environment, no matter how microscopic the decision, we reinforce our self-efficacy.
So the reward the brain is chasing isn't the outcome. The reward is the feeling of being in charge.
Exactly. But if motivation requires a sense of control, how do we teach motivation to people who feel totally powerless?
That's the real challenge.
Yeah.
And we find a surprising answer in an environment that seems diametrically opposed to independent thought, the United States Marine Corps.
It is the ultimate paradox. You have an institution historically built on breaking down the individual ego and enforcing absolute, unquestioning obedience.
Right. But they found themselves facing a crisis of motivation. Let's look at a recruit named Eric Quintanilla.
Oh, Eric.
Yeah, Eric is 23 years old. His life is defined by inertia. He works a few hours a week at a local hobby shop, occasionally drives an ice delivery truck, spends most of his time playing World of Warcraft.
And he just got rejected for a minimum wage job selling cell phones at a mall kiosk.
Exactly. He has no direction, no drive, and no confidence. Joining the Marines is this desperate, last resort Hail Mary for him.
And he arrives at boot camp just as General Charles C. Krulak, the commandant of the Marine Corps, is fundamentally overhauling how the military trains its soldiers.
Why the overhaul?
Well, Krulak recognized a massive generational shift. He looked at recruits like Eric and realized they were a product of an increasingly sheltered, automated society.
They hadn't played rough neighborhood sports. They hadn't held demanding physical jobs.
Right, their entire lives had been structured by parents and teachers telling them exactly what to do. Krulak famously described these modern recruits as wet socks.
Wet socks. That's brutal.
It is, but it was accurate. They were compliant, but they were entirely passive. If you gave them a direct order, they would execute it. But if the situation changed and they lacked an order, they would just freeze.
Wait, but the military is famous for screaming at people and demanding blind obedience. How on earth does a system built on following orders teach young people to be independent, self-motivated thinkers?
Well, Krulak realized the old model of screaming at recruits until they obeyed just wasn't going to cut it anymore. Modern warfare requires extreme self-starters, soldiers who can adapt on the fly when communications break down.
So they didn't need obedience training. They needed a complete psychological rewiring.
Exactly. They needed to manufacture an internal locus of control.
Let's break that down because this is a foundational concept in psychology.
It really is. An individual's locus of control dictates how they view their relationship with the world.
If you have an external locus of control, you genuinely believe your life is dictated by forces outside your influence. You think success is about luck or the benevolence of a boss or just innate genetics.
Right, like if you fail a test, it's because the test was unfair. But if you have an internal locus of control, you believe your outcomes are a direct result of your own choices, your own effort, and your own resilience.
And the data on this is incredible one-sided. People possessing an internal locus of control categorically earn more money, maintain better relationships, experience less severe depression, and literally live longer.
It is the bedrock of a successful life. But for Krulak, the most important piece of research was proving that this locus of control isn't fixed at birth. It is a highly malleable, learned skill.
He was heavily influenced by research like Carol Dweck's landmark 1998 puzzle study, right?
Yes, the 1998 study. Dweck took a group of fifth graders and gave them a series of moderately difficult puzzles.
And after they finished, she split the kids into two groups to receive a single, specifically coded sentence of praise.
The first group was told, "You must be really smart at these."
Which sounds like a great compliment.
Yeah.
I mean, I would love to hear that.
It does sound great, but it's actually toxic because a 10-year-old has absolutely no control over their innate genetic intelligence.
So by praising their smarts, Dweck was artificially inflating their external locus of control. She was telling them their success relied on a fixed trait they couldn't alter.
Exactly. Now, the second group of children received a different sentence. "You must have worked really hard at these."
That praises effort, and effort is an active choice.
Yes. This subtly activated their internal locus of control, signaling that their success was a direct result of their own agency.
The fallout from these two sentences is just staggering.
It really is. When Dweck subsequently offered the children a choice between an easy puzzle or a highly challenging one, the kids praised for being smart, overwhelmingly chose the easy route.
Because they were terrified of failing and invalidating their smart label.
Right. They became easily frustrated and reported hating the experiment, because if they try hard and fail, it means they aren't smart anymore, and they have no control over that.
But the kids praised for working hard. They gleefully attacked the harder puzzles.
They pushed through frustration, they strategized, they spent significantly more time working, and they reported having a fantastic time.
They weren't afraid of the friction, because the friction was under their control.
So General Krulak looked at this and designed a boot camp that operated like that second form of praise. He wanted to construct scenarios that forced aimless recruits like Eric Quintanilla to experience the addictive dopamine hit of taking control.
He needed to create an environment where passive compliance mathematically guaranteed failure.
And this philosophy completely peaks during the Crucible. That's the infamous, grueling 54-hour final exam of Marine boot camp.
The recruits are operating on virtually no sleep, minimal food, and just intense physical exhaustion. And they arrive at an obstacle known as Sergeant Timmerman's tank.
Right. It's this massive, simulated toxic hazard pit. The recruits are given wooden boards and ropes, and the parameters are strict. You must bridge the gap without touching the ground.
If anyone touches the ground, the entire squad fails. But the drill instructor adds a paralyzing caveat.
Yeah, no one is allowed to take a single physical action without a direct verbal command from the designated squad leader.
To a recruit conditioned to just follow orders, this sounds standard. The leader speaks, the squad moves.
But immediately after giving this rule, the drill instructor forces every recruit to put on a heavy, suffocating gas mask.
The moment those masks go on, the entire command structure disintegrates. You cannot hear a word anyone is saying.
The squad leader is screaming instructions through the rubber mask, but it just comes out as muffled, incomprehensible static.
They are trapped. The rule says they must obey a verbal command, but the environment makes a verbal command physically impossible.
They are forced into a cognitive corner where they have to subversively break the rules to survive.
So, what happens? The squad leader realizes the verbal hierarchy is dead. So he starts improvising.
He utilizes exaggerated body language, violently shrugging his shoulders, pointing, and eventually he starts stomping his boots and screaming a rhythmic marching cadence at the absolute top of his lungs.
Not to give words, but just to project a beat that can vibrate through the masks.
Exactly. The squad intuitively catches the rhythm, syncs their movements to the physical cues, and they successfully cross the pit.
They completely disregarded the explicit rule of awaiting a clear verbal command. But the drill instructor doesn't punish them.
No, he enthusiastically praises them. The obstacle was a psychological trap designed to force them to rebel against paralysis.
The Marines are systematically teaching these young men and women to find loopholes, to assert their own authority when the system fails, to manually engage their own striatum.
But taking control is only the first half of the equation. Asserting agency gives you a spark of motivation, but a spark isn't enough to sustain you through prolonged, agonizing friction.
You have to convert that spark into a lasting fire. Which brings us to the final, brutal phase of the Crucible.
A grueling 9-mile hike up a mountain ominously named the Grim Reaper, carrying 80-pound packs.
The recruits' feet are bleeding. They are physically breaking down, vomiting on the side of the trail. The physical act of taking a step is pure agony.
And this is where they deploy a deeply ingrained cognitive trick. They lean on each other and they aggressively ask one simple question. Why?
A recruit looks at Eric Quintanilla, who's practically collapsing, and asks, "Why are you doing this?"
And Eric, gasping for air, responds, "To become a Marine and build a better life for my daughter."
He doesn't say, "Because a drill instructor ordered me to." He links the immediate excruciating pain of climbing a hill to a core, deeply personal value.
He turns a meaningless physical punishment into an active, meaningful choice. He is telling his brain, I am choosing this suffering to secure my family's future.
By linking a micro-action to a macro meaning, Eric Quintanilla is hacking his own locus of control. He transforms himself from a victim of circumstance into the architect of his own destiny.
And this mechanism, subversively asserting control and attaching it to personal meaning, isn't just a military survival tactic.
We see the exact same psychological phenomenon play out in an environment that is worlds away from a combat zone, nursing homes.
Yes. In the late 1990s, researchers began studying the wildly divergent health outcomes of nursing home residents.
You had people arriving at these facilities with similar ages, similar health profiles, and similar cognitive baselines.
Yet within a year, one group would rapidly decline, both physically and mentally, while another group would mysteriously thrive.
The researchers started observing daily behavioral patterns to find the discrepancy. And they discovered that the thriving residents were, for lack of a better term, absolute rebels.
The academic literature literally referred to them as subversives.
I love that.
They were residents who intuitively understood that if they surrendered to the frictionless, fully automated schedule of the institution, their locus of control would atrophy and they would begin to die.
They waged a daily war against compliance. In a facility in Santa Fe, researchers observed a group of residents who refused to accept the pre-plated meals handed to them.
Instead, they essentially ran a black market at the dining table, bartering their food items, trading a dinner roll for a fruit cup or peas for a slice of ham just so they could construct their own custom menus.
They were manufacturing friction just to prove they still had a choice.
In a facility in Little Rock, the rebellion was even more physical. The administrators had bolted the heavy wooden wardrobes to the walls so the rooms would maintain a uniform, easily cleanable layout.
A group of subversives actually found a crowbar left in an unlocked janitorial closet.
Unbelievable.
They smuggled it into their rooms and physically wrenched the heavy furniture off the walls so they could rearrange the layout to their own liking.
And when the horrified staff told them they could have simply filed a request for assistance, the residents bluntly replied that they didn't want the staff's help, and they certainly didn't need their permission.
The physiological data on these subversives is breathtaking. By constantly asserting their authority over their microscopic environment, they activated their internal locus of control.
Compared to the compliant residents who peacefully accepted the schedule, the subversives lived significantly longer.
They retained more muscle mass because they walked twice as much. They ate larger portions. They reported much higher levels of daily joy.
And ironically, they actually adhered to critical medical advice much better. They were fiercely alive because they proved it to themselves every single day through the friction of choice.
Which perfectly illuminates how Viola Philippe finally managed to save her husband, Robert, the Bayou mogul whose striatum had betrayed him.
Viola was legally blind, fiercely independent, and she fundamentally refused to let Robert waste away in front of the television.
She didn't know the neurobiology of the basal ganglia, but she instinctively understood the cure. She became his external striatum.
She ruthlessly forced him into the friction of choice. When she brought him lunch, she didn't just place a plate in front of him.
She stood there and interrogated him. Do you want soup or a sandwich? If you want a sandwich, do you want ham or turkey? Do you want mustard or mayo? Do you want ice water or apple juice?
She wouldn't let him passively accept reality. She manually jump-started his brain's dopamine reward center by forcing him to exercise agency.
And incredibly, over months and years of this relentless pressure, the neural pathways began to adapt. The apathy started to crack.
Robert started initiating conversations on his own. He started expressing spontaneous opinions. Viola rehabilitated his motivation by forcing him to practice the muscle of self-determination.
So how does the listener sitting in their car or at their desk right now operationalize this?
It's a great question, because if you are staring down a soul-crushing project or an inbox that makes you want to crawl under your desk, you cannot wait for inspiration to strike. You have to manufacture it.
You start by finding one singular micro-choice to assert control. Do not open the first email at the top of the stack that's letting the chronological algorithm dictate your actions.
Scroll down and deliberately choose an email from the dead middle of the pile.
If you are drafting a massive report, refuse to start at the executive summary. Decide to write the third paragraph of the conclusion first.
Choose a different chair to sit in. The actual content of the choice is largely irrelevant. The act of choosing is what matters.
It's a biological signal to your brain that you are not a passive victim of the task.
And then you apply the Marine Corps trick. You take 5 seconds to ask yourself why. You link that tiny subversive choice to a macro value.
I am choosing to aggressively clear these 20 emails right now, not because my boss expects it, but because I value my family, and I refuse to let this anxiety bleed into my evening with my kids.
You assert agency and you attach meaning. That is the anatomy of individual motivation.
But the moment we solve the puzzle of the individual, we introduce a highly volatile new variable. We've just engineered a highly motivated person with a fiercely internal locus of control.
They want to push the button. They want to rearrange the furniture.
So what happens when you take 5 of these highly motivated individuals, put them in a conference room together, and tell them to work as a team?
Well, their psychological needs immediately clash. Everyone is fighting to assert their own agency, which is a perfect recipe for a toxic turf war.
And this brings us to the second pillar of our deep dive, teams. And nobody understands this chaotic transition from individual to group better than Julia Rosofsky during her time at the Yale School of Management.
Right. Yale's MBA program is famous for its intensive study groups. They intentionally curate these groups to be hyper-diverse, brilliant, and collaborative.
These are the people who are supposed to become your lifelong professional network.
And Julia is assigned to a group, and on paper, they are a dream team. Former consultants, high-level startup executives, brilliant analytical minds.
But in reality, the group was an absolute nightmare.
Because every single member was an alpha trying to assert their internal locus of control over the group dynamic.
Exactly. They constantly talked over one another. They subtly jockeyed for the unspoken position of group leader.
If someone pitched an idea, the others would immediately tear it apart, masking their ego-driven takedowns as rigorous academic analysis.
Julia found herself dreading the meetings. She felt constantly on edge, hyper-aware of every word she spoke, terrified of making a minor misstep that would be weaponized against her.
It was an environment completely devoid of trust.
But simultaneously, Julia joined a totally separate group for an extracurricular case competition, and the atmospheric difference was jarring.
It was like stepping onto a different planet. This case competition team was arguably even more diverse in their professional backgrounds. An army officer, a think tank researcher, a manager for a refugee program.
But the friction there was entirely productive. They laughed. They enthusiastically built on each other's ideas, no matter how absurd.
During a brainstorm for a campus business, Julia half-jokingly suggested they turn a struggling snack shop into a room full of nap pods for exhausted students.
In her study group, an idea like nap pods would have been instantly shredded with financial models and sarcastic remarks.
But her case competition team leaned in. They spent an hour passionately trying to figure out how to monetize a nap pod business through high-end earplug sales and subscription models.
They didn't ultimately go with the idea. They pivoted to a micro gym concept and actually won the entire competition. But the outcome of the pitch wasn't the point.
Right. The point was the psychological environment. They protected the creative vulnerability of the team.
So Julia is left with this profound question. Why was one room of brilliant people so deeply toxic, while another room of equally brilliant people achieved such effortless synergy?
A few years later, Julia takes a job at Google in their People Analytics division, and she gets the chance to answer that question on a massive scale.
Google had just wrapped up a massive internal study called Project Oxygen, which successfully reverse-engineered the traits of a great manager.
And now, they were launching Project Aristotle. The goal was to use Google's unparalleled data capabilities to reverse engineer the perfect team.
They spent years feeding every conceivable metric into their algorithms. They look at the composition of the teams, the who.
Did extroverts naturally balance out introverts? Did teams composed of close friends outperform teams of strangers?
Did gender balance, educational background, or tenure at the company move the needle? They searched desperately for a pattern.
And they found absolutely nothing. The data was a mess.
Wait, nothing?
Nothing. They had two teams with identical demographic makeups, identical levels of individual intelligence, working on similar engineering problems. One team was a runaway success, and the other was paralyzed by infighting.
So the who didn't matter at all.
The breakthrough for Project Aristotle only came when they stopped looking at the composition of the individuals and started analyzing the invisible connective tissue between them. They started studying group norms.
Group norms are the unwritten behavioral standards, the subtle traditions that dictate how a specific group operates.
Does this team allow people to interrupt? Do they spend the first 10 minutes of a meeting gossiping about their weekends, or do they immediately dive into an agenda?
When someone makes a mistake, is it a point of collective learning or a moment for finger pointing?
To understand which specific group norms actually drive high performance, Google's analysts turned to the landmark research of a Harvard organizational behavioral scientist named Amy Edmondson.
Back in 1991, Edmondson set out to study medical errors across various hospital wards.
Her initial hypothesis was highly logical. The wards that demonstrated the highest cohesion, the best leadership, and the most professional team dynamics would naturally make the fewest medical mistakes.
It makes perfect sense. Good teams make fewer errors.
But when Edmondson actually runs the data, the numbers come back entirely inverted. It is a massive statistical paradox.
The teams with the highest peer ratings, the most respected nurse managers, and the tightest cohesion were objectively logging the most severe medical errors.
They were reporting instances of giving patients lidocaine instead of heparin or administering amphetamines instead of aspirin.
So Edmondson looks at this data and finds something that makes zero sense. How is that possible? Did a tight-knit team culture somehow make nurses reckless and sloppy?
She spent months digging into the granular survey data, and she finally realized the flaw in her premise. The highly cohesive teams weren't making more mistakes, they were reporting more mistakes.
Oh, you're actually being honest.
Precisely. Edmondson looked closely at the wards that appear to be high-performing with extremely low error rates. What she found was a deeply punitive, rigid culture.
The nurse managers on those wards often wore formal business suits rather than scrubs. The atmosphere was incredibly austere and professional.
But if a young nurse made a minor miscalculation, they felt like they were being put on trial. The group norm was perfection.
So what did the nurses do? They simply hid their mistakes. They covered up near misses.
The wards that looked the best on paper were actually the most dangerous because their culture of fear was burying critical data.
Contrast that with the wards logging high error rates. The culture there was vastly different.
The managers wore scrubs, they openly admitted their own fallibility and talked about their own past mistakes.
The unwritten group norm was, medicine is chaotic, we are human, and our primary job is to catch each other's slips.
A nurse didn't fear retribution for speaking up, they feared the consequences of staying silent.
Edmondson gave this highly specific group norm a name that became the bedrock of Google's Project Aristotle, psychological safety.
It is defined as a shared, tacit belief that the team environment is a safe place for interpersonal risk-taking.
It means you will not be embarrassed, rejected, or punished for admitting a failure, asking a seemingly naive question, or pitching a wild idea.
Now, if you are a hard-charging executive listening to this, psychological safety can sound dangerously soft.
Oh yeah, it sounds like a mandate to lower standards, hold hands, avoid conflict, and applaud everyone for just participating. How do you reconcile psychological safety with the need for ruthless excellence and rigorous debate?
That is the critical nuance. Psychological safety is not about being nice. It is about candor.
And there's no better historical stress test for this concept than the original writer's room of Saturday Night Live.
If there's a group of people completely devoid of polite corporate niceties, it is cocaine-fueled comedy writers in the 1970s.
The mythological lore of SNL is that it was this serendipitous gathering of misfits. John Belushi, Chevy Chase, Gilda Radner, Dan Aykroyd, who bonded together as a happy family to revolutionize television.
But the reality documented by those who were there was a chaotic, ego-driven bloodbath. They were mostly in their early 20s, deeply insecure, incredibly ambitious, and fiercely competing for limited airtime. The environment was vicious.
There's a famous story about Michael O'Donoghue, one of the head writers. The actor Garrett Morris had spent weeks painstakingly writing a sketch.
He proudly hands the script to O'Donoghue.
O'Donoghue takes it, reads it in silence, says, "Great, Garrett," and casually drops the entire script into a garbage can right in front of Morris's face.
Ouch. In another instance, the writer Alan Zweibel would write jokes specifically for Gilda Radner. Radner, being a perfectionist, would take a red pen and violently edit the jokes.
And Zweibel would get so offended by the critique that he would passively, aggressively withhold his best material from her for weeks.
By every conventional corporate metric, this is a hopelessly toxic environment. It is a steady group of clashing alphas operating with zero respect. It should have imploded.
So how do they consistently generate paradigm-shifting brilliance week after week?
The answer lies in the deeply counterintuitive leadership of the show's creator, Lorne Michaels. Michaels completely rejected the traditional idea of a harmonious team.
He actively recruited narcissists. He famously stated, "I don't want a team, I want a bunch of eyes."
He wanted massive, volatile egos. But he managed that volatility by ruthlessly enforcing extreme social sensitivity behind the scenes.
He built a structural framework that forced these massive egos to engage with one another on a human level.
He would be the one pulling a devastated, crying writer into his office at 3 a.m. to build them back up.
During pitch meetings, Michaels instituted a non-negotiable rule. The entire room had to sit and listen to every single pitch, all the way to the end, no matter how awkward, weird, or fundamentally unfunny it was.
You were not allowed to check out. He once forced the entire cast and crew to sit through a rehearsal of a wildly obscene commercial parody written by Michael O'Donoghue.
He made them perform it 18 times in a row. Everyone in the room knew the network censors would kill the sketch immediately, but Michaels forced them to do it simply to validate O'Donoghue's creative effort.
What Michaels was doing was meticulously separating the work from the ego. By enforcing these norms of deep listening and emotional validation, he created an underlying bedrock of psychological safety.
He created a space where people could viciously, ruthlessly critique a joke without the writer feeling like their intrinsic worth as a human being was under attack.
Even after O'Donoghue threw Garrett Morris's script in the trash, a brutal professional critique, the underlying culture allowed them to go back, smooth over the ego damage, and sit down to co-write a totally different sketch together.
Lorne Michaels intuitively grasped what behavioral scientists would later prove with hard data. A massive joint study by researchers at Carnegie Mellon and MIT sought to measure if teams possess a collective intelligence, a group IQ that is functionally separate from the individual IQs of the members.
They set up a classic A/B test. They gathered hundreds of volunteers and divided them into groups. Team A represents the corporate ideal.
They are composed of highly intelligent, credentialed professionals. They elect a clear leader. They strictly adhere to an agenda. They speak efficiently one at a time and never veer off topic.
On paper, Team A is an unstoppable juggernaut. Then you observe Team B. Team B is a messy amalgam of executives, middle managers, and entry-level employees.
They don't have a clear hierarchy. They constantly interrupt each other. They go on wild tangents. They spent the last 5 minutes of a work session gossiping about a movie they saw.
It looks incredibly inefficient. But the researchers gave these teams complex, multi-layered puzzles.
They asked them to plan a highly complicated shopping trip with competing geographical priorities, or engage in lateral thinking exercises like brainstorming alternative uses for a brick.
And across the board, Team B consistently, routinely humiliated Team A in performance.
And here is the crucial finding. The individual intelligence of the members has zero correlation with the team's success.
Putting 5 absolute geniuses in Team A did not make Team A smarter. What generated the massive collective intelligence of Team B were 2 highly specific, measurable group norms.
Norm number 1, equality and distribution of conversational turn-taking.
In Team B, if you track the data over a 2-hour meeting, every single person spoke for roughly the same amount of time.
The conversation naturally ebbed and flowed, but the airtime was mathematically egalitarian.
In Team A, 1 or 2 highly confident experts dominated the airspace, which effectively nullified the intelligence of the quiet members.
Norm number 2 is where it gets incredibly fascinating. High average social sensitivity.
The researchers quantified this using a well-known psychological assessment called the Reading the Mind in the Eyes test.
Participants are shown tightly cropped photographs of just a person's eyes, and they have to deduce complex emotional states, distinguishing if the eyes look pensive, annoyed, skeptical, or anxious.
Team B scored off the charts on this test. They possessed a highly developed capacity to intuit how their teammates were feeling based purely on microexpressions and nonverbal cues.
If someone in Team B got cut off and looked slightly deflated, another member would subconsciously notice the shift in their eyes and actively steer the conversation back to them.
They were constantly running emotional diagnostics on each other. This is exactly what Lorne Michaels forced upon his writers by making them listen to every pitch.
He was forcing them to look at each other, to read the room, to build that social sensitivity.
So how do we translate this into actionable advice for the listener?
Right, in your daily meetings.
If you want to build a team that operates with massive collective intelligence, you have to temporarily suspend your obsession with the work itself and focus on debugging the human interactions.
If you are leading a meeting, your primary job is essentially being an air traffic controller of attention. You have to actively track conversational equity.
There are managers at Google who literally draw a seating chart on a notepad and place a check mark next to a person's name every time they speak.
If the meeting is ending and the check marks are wildly skewed, they refuse to adjourn until the quiet members are brought into the fold.
You have to model vulnerability. If you are the boss, explicitly talk about a time you blew a major presentation.
That signals to the room that failure is a data point, not an indictment of character.
If someone interrupts a junior employee, you must actively intervene and say, "Hold on, I want to hear the end of Sarah's thought."
To build a genuinely high-performing team, you have to be willing to surrender some of your own individual need for alpha control and heavily invest your energy into the social sensitivity of the group.
But this brings us to a terrifying modern reality. We can solve the motivation of the individual. We can engineer the psychological safety of the team.
Are they bulletproof?
No. Because we are increasingly taking these highly functioning human units and placing them inside highly automated algorithmic systems that are designed to do the thinking for them.
We are placing them in environments that are quietly, systematically hijacking their cognitive reflexes. Which brings us to our final pillar, focus.
We exist in an unprecedented era of convenience. We have software that auto-drafts our emails, cars that maintain our lane on the highway, algorithms that curate our news feeds.
We have outsourced the friction of daily attention to machines. And while this grants us immense efficiency, it introduces a profound and dangerous vulnerability into the human brain.
To understand the stakes of this vulnerability, we have to look at the catastrophic tragedy of Air France Flight 447.
It's May 31st, 2009. An Airbus A330 is departing Rio de Janeiro, heading across the Atlantic to Paris with 228 souls on board.
Now, to understand the context, the A330 is not just a plane. It is a flying supercomputer. It is a marvel of modern automation, designed specifically to eliminate human error.
Decades ago, flying a commercial airliner was a mentally exhausting, highly proactive job. Pilots had to manually calculate wind vectors, constantly adjust the throttle, and physically wrestle with the yoke.
Today, the paradigm has completely flipped. Flying is overwhelmingly reactive.
The computer flies the plane with microscopic precision, and the highly trained humans sit in the cockpit primarily to monitor the screens, waiting to react if the machine requests assistance.
It is the ultimate frictionless environment.
Which creates a lethal complacency. 4 hours into the flight, they're cruising smoothly in the dark. The captain goes back to the crew rest area for a scheduled nap, leaving 2 junior co-pilots, Pierre-Cedric Bonin and David Robert, in charge.
The atmosphere in the cockpit is relaxed. They're talking, they're comfortable.
But outside, they fly into the upper reaches of a tropical storm system. The temperature rapidly drops, and ice crystals instantly clog the plane's pitot tubes, the external sensors that feed airspeed data to the computer.
Without airspeed data, the automated system does exactly what it is programmed to do. It determines it can no longer safely guarantee the flight envelope, so it abruptly disengages the autopilot, sounds a blaring alarm, and hands manual control back to the startled humans.
To understand the cognitive collapse that happens next, we have to look at the work of David Strayer, a prominent cognitive psychologist.
He describes the human attention span not as a static resource, but as a spotlight.
When we engage in active, friction-heavy tasks, our spotlight is tight, bright, and focused.
But when we allow an automated system to take over, like clicking on cruise control on an empty highway or engaging in autopilot, our brain naturally seeks to conserve glucose and energy.
The spotlight dims. It becomes wide and incredibly diffused. We go into a state of cognitive standby.
But then, an unexpected variable shatters the silence. The alarm blares. The brain is violently jolted out of standby mode.
The pilot's attention span is like a spotlight. For 4 hours, it's been dim and diffused. Suddenly, an alarm goes off, and the brain panics, turning that spotlight on maximum brightness and pointing it at the very first thing it sees.
A massive surge of adrenaline hits the system. But because the spotlight was previously diffused, it doesn't know where to look. It is frantic.
So it locks onto the very first, most visually obvious stimulus it can find, completely ignoring all surrounding context.
Psychologists call this cognitive tunneling. Your field of vision literally and metaphorically narrows to a pinprick.
You become so hyperfixated on one immediate data point that you lose all common sense and situational awareness.
This is exactly the physiological trap that snares pilot Pierre-Cedric Bonin. The alarm screams, he is startled, he grabs the manual control stick, and his frantic spotlight locks onto the primary flight display screen directly in front of his face.
On that screen is a small digital icon of an airplane, indicating the plane's roll, whether the wings are perfectly level. Because of the turbulence, the little icon is slightly off-kilter.
Bonin gets deeply, obsessively tunneled on leveling that icon.
But in his panicked physical effort to roll the wings level, he accidentally pulls straight back on the control stick, pitching the nose of the massive airliner sharply up into the thin night air.
At 38,000 feet, where the air is incredibly thin, pitching the nose up is a catastrophic error. It bleeds off your forward airspeed and destroys your lift.
The plane enters an aerodynamic stall. It physically stops flying and simply begins falling out of the sky like a stone.
And while Bonin is locked in his cognitive tunnel, obsessing over the roll icon, his co-pilot, David Robert, is trapped in a completely different tunnel.
Robert's spotlight has locked onto a different screen that is rapidly scrolling diagnostic text messages from the central computer.
Neither man is looking at the macro situation. They are plummeting. A synthetic voice is screaming, "Stall! Stall!" in the cockpit. But Bonin stubbornly continues to pull back on the stick.
Why? Because the panic has triggered a secondary psychological glitch known as reactive thinking.
Reactive thinking is what happens when the prefrontal cortex is completely overwhelmed by stress. The brain decides it doesn't have the time or bandwidth to logically process the novel situation, so it frantically searches its hard drive for a deeply ingrained habitual reflex to outsource the decision to.
In the cockpit audio, Bonin is heard saying, "I'm in TOGA." Right. TOGA stands for Takeoff Go Around.
It is a standard maneuver that commercial pilots practice relentlessly in flight simulators. If you are approaching a runway to land, you are near the ground in thick air, and something goes wrong, you execute a TOGA.
You slam the thrust to maximum and you pull the nose up to climb away from the danger.
It is a muscle memory designed to save your life at 500 feet of altitude. But at 38,000 feet, executing a TOGA maneuver guarantees a stall.
Bonin wasn't analyzing his altitude or the laws of aerodynamics. His focus was totally hijacked, so he outsourced his decision-making to a habit because his focus was hijacked.
And here is the most heartbreaking detail of the entire tragedy. After about 60 seconds of falling, the plane descends into warmer air.
The ice on the pitot tubes melts. The sensors clear.
The computer immediately begins feeding the pilots the exact pristine data they need to save the aircraft.
The screens clearly show their airspeed is dangerously low and their angle of attack is completely wrong. All they have to do is look at the instruments, realize they are in a stall, and push the nose down to regain speed.
But they are so hopelessly trapped in their respective cognitive tunnels, relying on panicked reactive thinking, they literally cannot process the information staring them in the face.
The captain bursts back into the cockpit. But he's jolted from a dead sleep and has no context, so he enters a tunnel of confusion as well.
They plummeted for 3 agonizing minutes, utterly bewildered by what the plane was doing, until they hit the Atlantic Ocean.
228 people perished, not because of a mechanical failure, but because of a catastrophic failure of human attention in an automated environment.
The terrifying takeaway is that as we automate our lives, we are all sitting in the cockpit of Flight 447.
So how do we protect ourselves? How do we prevent cognitive tunneling when the inevitable alarm goes off in our daily lives?
The antidote to this passive vulnerability is found in an equally high-stress, high-stakes environment, the neonatal intensive care unit.
Researchers, specifically a cognitive scientist named Beth Crandall, spent time studying NICU wards because they noticed a fascinating discrepancy.
Some veteran nurses possessed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate when a premature baby was about to crash, often intervening hours before the highly sensitive automated heart monitors and blood oxygen alarms sounded any warning.
Crandall wanted to know how these nurses were outsmarting the machines. They focused on a nurse named Darlene.
Darlene is walking down the aisle of the ward, casually glancing at the incubators. The automated monitors on one specific baby are glowing green. The vitals look perfect.
Another nurse is standing right there observing the infant and sees absolutely no cause for concern, but Darlene stops dead in her tracks.
She looks closely at the baby. She notices the infant's skin is subtly mottled, just a slight marbling of color.
She notices the baby's belly looks a millimeter more distended than it should.
And then she looks at the baby's heel, where blood had been drawn hours earlier for a routine test. Instead of a normal dry scab, she sees a tiny, crimson blot of fresh blood pushing through the Band-Aid.
Darlene instantly recognizes that the baby is in the early stages of catastrophic systemic distress, specifically sepsis.
She hits the emergency alarm, the medical team floods in, and they administer antibiotics just in time to save the child's life.
The machines missed it. The other nurse missed it. How did Darlene see it?
The secret is that Nurse Darlene was operating with the exact opposite cognitive posture of the Air France pilots. She wasn't treating her job as a reactive exercise.
She wasn't waiting for an alarm to dictate her focus.
She was relentlessly, constantly building what psychologists call mental models.
Darlene was running a continuous, highly detailed simulation in her mind before she even stepped onto the ward floor.
She would tell herself a story. I'm about to look at a 32-week-old preemie. The baby's skin should be a specific shade of pink. The belly should be flat. A heel prick from 2 hours ago should have coagulated into a dark scab.
She built a robust physical model of reality in her imagination.
So when she walks past that incubator, her brain isn't being asked to parse a million overwhelming data points from scratch. Her spotlight of attention is already incredibly sharp.
All her brain has to do is lay her mental model over the physical reality and look for a discrepancy.
Exactly. The mottled skin and the crimson blood drop violently clashed with the story she was telling herself.
That clash between expectation and reality is the ultimate safeguard against cognitive tunneling. When you have a mental model, an unexpected event doesn't trigger panic. It triggers targeted, analytical curiosity.
The Air France pilots panicked because they had no mental model of what the aircraft should be doing at the moment the autopilot quit. They were mentally empty.
Darlene was mentally full. Anticipation outsmarts reaction.
This is the critical takeaway for the listener trying to navigate a world engineered for distraction. You cannot allow your environment or your algorithms to dictate your attention.
You have to actively project your mind into the future.
Before you pull out of your driveway for the morning commute, take 10 seconds to visualize the route. Tell yourself a story about where the bottleneck will be, which lane you need to be in, and what time you should arrive.
Before you walk into a contentious budget meeting, don't just review the numbers. Build a mental model of the human dynamics.
Tell yourself a story. John is going to object to the Q3 projections first. Sarah will likely defend them. I will need to bridge the gap with the revised data.
When you actively construct these mental narratives, your brain is primed. The moment reality deviates from your script, the moment a rogue driver swerves into your lane, or John brings up an objection you didn't foresee, you're not startled into a panicked, reactive cognitive tunnel.
The discrepancy jolts your focus into sharp, proactive relief. You retain control of your analytical mind because you anticipated the friction.
Which brings our journey full circle. Let's synthesize what we have unpacked today. The architecture of true productivity is not built on mindless effort. It is an interconnected ecosystem of deliberate, often uncomfortable choices.
First, motivation isn't a gift. It is a biological engine that we must manually crank by asserting our internal locus of control over the smallest details of our lives and linking those subversive choices to a deeply held why.
Second, teams do not thrive on the sheer intellectual horsepower of their members or by avoiding conflict.
They achieve collective genius by ruthlessly engineering psychological safety-forcing conversational equality and modeling deep social sensitivity so that the friction of ideas never destroys the human ego.
And finally, focus is the ultimate defense mechanism in an automated world. It is preserved not by staring harder at a screen, but by constantly telling ourselves stories about the future.
By building relentless mental models, we ensure that when the alarms of life inevitably sound, we do not tunnel into panic, but instead rise to the occasion with piercing clarity.
And if we take all of this research, the neuroscience of the stray atom, the data from Google, the cognitive psychology of the cockpit, it leaves us with a deeply provocative, perhaps unsettling question to carry with us.
We have constructed a modern society that views friction as the ultimate enemy. We crave a frictionless existence.
We want apps to predict our texts, algorithms to curate our entertainment, and smart systems to seamlessly manage our homes. We measure progress by how much effort we can eliminate.
We want the computer to push the button for us.
Precisely. But if the biological reality is that our deepest motivation, our most resilient team dynamics, and our sharpest life-saving focus are all generated exclusively by grappling with friction.
By making active, difficult choices, navigating the messy reality of human emotions, and forcing our brains to project models into the future.
Is our relentless societal pursuit of a fully automated, frictionless life actually engineering the very capacity for productivity right out of our species?
The ultimate irony. The easier we make it, the less capable we become of doing it.
That is a massive concept to chew on the next time you find yourself blindly following a GPS or letting an AI draft your email. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive and for deliberately choosing to invest your focus with us today.
Take back the friction in your life.
Assert control over your choices today. Because productivity isn't about running faster on a hamster wheel. It's about having the clarity to step off the wheel, walk into the control room, and finally engage the transmission yourself.